A new revolution is sweeping across the African continent, unstoppable in its momentum, fueled by collective determination for change amidst current geopolitical events. Long before the arrival of Europeans in Africa, the African people mined gold and iron and treated crude oil for fire and lighting the nights. Metalwork was a common skill among different tribes on the continent. The idea that Europeans introduced these skills to Africa and therefore have the right to control its resources is both imperialist and racist. This misconception has been perpetuated for so long that a significant number of people around the world still wrongly believe that Africans cannot manage their own affairs and need outside guidance. Western powers often refer to Africa as their backyard or sphere of influence. However, Europe does not own Africa. Africa is the cradle of humanity. Africans are not European subjects. France, supported by the European Union, continues to interfere and create instability on the continent to maintain control of its vast natural resources. In January 2013, France sent 400 troops to Mali to combat rebel fighters that President François Hollande claimed were linked to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, stating that Europe needed to be safeguarded. Hollande insisted that France's military intervention complied with international law. The European country only intervenes in regions rich in gas, gold, oil, and uranium. During the colonial era, European powers controlled much of Africa and restricted the production and acquisition of advanced weaponry by Africans to maintain their dominance and prevent uprisings. Africa has become the playground of Europeans for all sorts of malevolent social and medical experiments. Terrorists have a cunning habit of coming out of nowhere to attack people who oppose Western exploitation of their lands.
Bring back our army. Bring back our army.
The term France-Afrique refers to the French policy characterized by support of oppressive regimes to ensure France's energy supply. This policy has resulted in a generation of low self-esteem Africans who view Europeans as superior. Many have died and continue to die trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in search of a better life in Europe. In 1945, when France was liberated, uprisings occurred across the French colonial empire. Convinced that France could not suppress the new African movements, General de Gaulle proposed a new status for its African colonies. Africans were given two choices: vote for immediate independence or internal autonomy within the French community. This was part of the referendum of 1958, which created the French Fifth Republic. 2 years later, in 1960, African countries gained their independence, but independence did not equate to freedom from European influence. France still needed to exploit Africa's energy resources to remain a global power. After a long, bloody battle with the imperialist, Algeria gained its independence from France in 1962. ELF, the French public company founded on the Saharan wealth, was asked overnight to leave Algeria. In 1967, Pierre Guillaumat was appointed to head ELF and attempted to persuade the Algerians to continue extracting their oil, but the new Algerian government declined. Under President Houari Boumediene, Algeria nationalized its oil industry. France now desperately needed a new source of oil to control in Africa. The empire turned to the West African state of Gabon. However, there was one problem. Gabon had also achieved its independence in 1960. Knowing well that the Gabonese would never agree to be exploited right after gaining their independence, Pierre Guillaumat, the chief of ELF, allowed the oil company to fund secret operations in the country. France also appointed Jacques Foccart, the right-hand man of Charles de Gaulle, known as Mr. Africa, to head all African covert operations to secure French interests on the continent. Foucault was responsible for the intelligence network Free France during World War II, and he used that expertise to build networks of agents across the newly independent African countries with the help of the French secret services. Thousands of French teachers were sent to teach in universities and high schools, many of whom reported back to the French secret services. These intelligence networks became known as the Foucault Network. The French Secret Service also recruited Maurice Robert, an ex-French commando who served in the colonial projects in Indochina, as the head of the African section. Robert's first job was to destabilize Guinea by eliminating the newly elected President Sékou Touré, who had declared independence in 1958, 2 years after Morocco and Tunisia. Sékou Touré was so anti-French that he declared he preferred freedom in poverty over wealth in slavery under France.
Nous préférons la pauvreté dans la liberté à la richesse dans l'esclavage.
Offended by Sékou Touré's speech, Robert reacted with extreme anger to punish the African leader. When Guinea gained its independence, General de Gaulle believed that black people wouldn't be able to run the country, but he was wrong. The African state was flourishing without France. The colonizer needed to maintain the narrative that Africans are incompetent to justify French intervention in Africa. To develop Guinea, the president turned to the Soviets. Knowing that the French might try to take him down, he had his personal guards trained by the Cuban military. This was considered a strong provocation to the Europeans, who deeply believed they owned Africa and its people. It was the beginning of the Cold War, and the collective West was against the idea of socialism uniting Africa. The United States' deep hatred for socialism and communism gave the green light to France to police the continent. France was free to carry out its mission in Africa by any means possible, with the complete silence of Western nations. Africans who found the Soviets' ideas of socialism compatible with their cultural ways of life were neutralized by the French secret services. Guinea had previously refused to adopt the colonial currency, the CFA franc, which France printed for its colonies. Under orders from the Secret Service, Maurice Robert counterfeited Guinea's new currency. He wrote in his memoir that he had achieved his mission and that the Guinean people wouldn't be able to recover from it. The president became vulnerable and unpopular, leaving only the task of arming the opposition to remove him from office. However, the Soviets tipped off Sékou Touré, informing him about the European and American treachery in the country. While France failed to eliminate the president, they succeeded in ruining the economy of a poor African country and armed the opposition to kill their own people for European interests. It is not that Africans cannot manage their own affairs. The truth is that Europeans won't allow any single African country to develop. The Secret Service continued its European supremacy agenda in Cameroon. After gaining independence in January 1960, Cameroon's first national election was held in April of the same year. The Secret Services trained and imposed Amadou Ahidjo as the first president of Cameroon. During the election, the citizens were forced to chant songs about Africans voting to get rid of their savage nature. Amadou Ahidjo, the French puppet, led an unpopular regime. On the other hand, Félix Roland Moumié, the independence leader and anti-colonial activist, was the people's choice. He was the head of the Socialist Party, the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, UPC, which was banned by France because of its Marxist ideology. With ever-growing support, Félix the people's leader has clearly become more than an annoyance to the French. Knowing that he was constantly under surveillance by the French intelligence services, he ensured that he never flew over French territory and avoided the airspace of the countries that were members of the French community. Despite all the precautions, in October 1960, Félix Moumié was poisoned in Geneva, Switzerland by William Bechtel, an agent of the French Secret Service. It was later determined by the Swiss police that Félix was poisoned with thallium, a highly toxic metal. Thallium is colorless, tasteless, and odorless, which makes it difficult to detect when administered covertly in food or drinks. Félix Moumié is no more. However, it will take more than poison to break the spirit of the Cameroonian. France handpicks African presidential candidates and eliminates any rivalry. Those who are put in power are all subservient to France and its interests. The African puppets are named black governors to show that nothing has changed since the colonial era when the governors reported directly to the metropole. The French policy France-Afrique is in full swing. In Gabon, the new president Léon Meba, chosen by the secret services, was summoned to Paris to recite a humiliating speech prepared for him. The president stood in front of Europeans and essentially invited them to come take possession of the land. Not only French people, but also criminals from across European countries flocked to Gabon.
Tout Gabonais a deux patries, le Gabon et puis la France. Lorsque vous viendrez à Libreville, vous vous y sentirez chez vous. Comme moi, je me sens ici, chez moi.
Gabon is a forest-rich country. About 85% of its land area is covered by tropical rainforests, making it one of the most densely forested countries in Africa. These forests are part of the Congo Basin, which is the second largest rainforest in the world after the Amazon. French companies have depleted Gabon's forests and timber resources through extensive logging activities. The French were everywhere in Gabon. Fearing a Gabonese uprising, the Secret Service appointed a number of African collaborators to assist the government. President Léon Meba was personally supervised by Jacques Foccart. Here is what you need to know. Jacques Foccart was in reality the true ruler of Gabon. He made all the decisions and dictated what the African president must or must not do. All the French assigned to the Gabonese presidency reported back to Jacques Foccart. Léon Meba feared the Europeans around him because they could eliminate or replace him at any moment if he ever failed to follow their orders. In February 1964, tired of being slaves in their own country after gaining independence, a group of army and police officers stormed the presidential palace, arrested the president, and forced him to announce his resignation. Unfortunately, for the brave freedom fighters, the puppet President Meba was forced to sign away the country's sovereignty to France. Secret documents had already been signed, giving away the country's natural resources to Europeans, and it was clearly noted that any aggression in Gabon against French interests would be met with the full force of the French army. The puppet president was rescued in a forest village by French commandos and reinstated in the presidential palace. Léon Meba reappeared on national television, praising the Europeans as heroes who rescued him from his savage people.
J'attendais la mort. Cette faucheuse de personnes. Je l'ai vue de près. J'étais à 1 millimètre de la mort. Et je ne sais par quel miracle je me trouve au milieu de vous.
France, fearing for the president's safety, created and installed a new European presidential guard to watch him. Bob Maloubier, the Secret Service agent, assembled European police servicemen, snipers, and special forces to closely watch the president. Any suspicious activities around the president were met with excessive force. When President Léon Mba's health started deteriorating, Jacques Foccart, the man known as Mr. Africa, ordered the president to amend the constitution to elect a vice president who could replace him without an election. The president did exactly what the Europeans ordered. Albert Bernard Bongo was appointed as vice president of Gabon in March 1967. President Meba died later in November that same year. After his death, Albert Bongo became president of the republic without elections. There was no outrage in the West because it is taught and believed that Africa needed to be guided and controlled because they cannot manage their own affairs. African presidents have learned to pledge allegiance to European nations, particularly France, the US, and the UK, if they wish to survive in office. Africa is not for the Africans, but for the Europeans. The new president of Gabon was instructed by the French oil company ELF to have Africans sing and worship the company as their savior. The company controlled the Gabonese economy and was directly linked to the secret services. The increased demand for oil production forced the Gabonese people to start protesting against ELF's exploitation of the country. Along the coast of the West African states in 1967, European powers created another humanitarian crisis in the former British colony of Nigeria. The oil-rich region of Nigeria broke away as the Republic of Biafra. A war broke out, creating extreme famine conditions. French television showed children dying of starvation to manufacture consent to arm the Biafran people in exchange for their oil against the Nigerian government. Despite signing agreements to extract oil in Nigeria, ELF funded and armed rebels in Biafra to fight the Nigerian government, essentially pitting Biafrans against their own people while extracting oil on both sides. Every major European powers was selling weapons to both sides, including the white South Africans. The Secret Service specifically opened training camps on Gabonese soil to train Biafran rebels, all funded by ELF. France knew the Biafran won't win against the much larger Nigerian army, but the goal was to destabilize the region and profit from the African death and sufferings.